welcome. My name is Corin Little, and I'm the organizer of Out of Sight Chicago. And today I'm talking with Jennie Klein about her new book that she co-edited with Natalie Loveless, Responding to Sight, the performance works of Marilyn Arsem. And I'm coming to you residing from the ancestral homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Adawat, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi peoples. Out of Sight, as an organization, is particularly interested in the conversation and the questions of ownership of site, of place. And this has been one of the this idea of public space is one of the main questions that we're going to be talking about at the up and coming symposium, and hopefully it'll end in also in our conversation today about this new book. Jennie Klein is an art historian and professor of art history at Ohio University and writes on contemporary performance art and the intersection of gender and visual culture. She received her PhD from the University of Southern California in 1998, and she is the co-editor of Responding to Sight, the performance art of Marilyn Arsem, published by Intellect Press in the fall of 2020. Dr. Klein is presently completing 2 books. The first, Assuming the Ecosexual Position, under contract, the University of Minnesota Press, is a compilation of the work and writing of Annie Sprinkle and Elizabeth Stevens. The second project, the Routledge Companion to Performance Art, is co-edited with Dr. Loveless. Dr. Klein has published a number of essays on feminist artists, most recently on Miriam Schaer and Chuyia. Am I saying that correctly? I'm totally not.
It sounds like Chuyia.
Chuyia.
Yeah, like Julia.
Chuyia.
Yes.
Dr. Klein has published in PAG Frontiers, the Journal of Lesbian Studies, Feminist Studies, and Paradoxa, ArtPulse, Art Papers, and New Examiners, Genders, and Afterimage. Dr. Klein also has a blog, Writing on Performance, and Dr. Klein teaches courses on contemporary art and theory, performance art and theory, and the intersection of gender and art. In addition, she serves as the graduate director and associate director of the School of Art and Design and director of studies for the Honors Tutorial College at Ohio University. And it is a great pleasure to be with you here today. I think the last time I was properly in the room with you, I think was in the fall of 2017. So that was several years ago, but we've seen each other since. I wanted, the first question I wanted to ask you, there's the book that you've co-edited with Natalie Loveless. It is written in like 4 sections, and the 4th section explores the idea of pedagogy in relationship to Marilyn's performance practice. And I wondered if you could, I'm specifically thinking maybe about the chapter, well, Marilyn writes a chapter about this herself. And, there's a fascinating chapter that starts off with a quote from Marilyn, which talks about remembering that nothing remains, by Kathy O'Dell. So I wondered if you could expand on these theories of performance and pedagogy, because as a professor yourself.
Well, absolutely. We were really interested in the relationship that Marilyn Arsem had between her own work and her teaching. So I should say, before I talk about the article that you just mentioned, that she taught for many years at the Museum School associated with the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And she also gave too numerous really to mention, but they are in the appendix of this book, workshops and sort of short teaching events really all over the world. And in fact, I participated in one of her workshops in Chicago. So she was both a teacher for a long duration, working over the course of the semester, and then also a teacher for a very short duration. And I should also mention that although I met Marilyn after I had completed my PhD and not as a student, that Natalie was originally Marilyn's student. So much of what Natalie talks about in her conclusion is what it meant to be Marilyn's student, what Marilyn taught her. And then we also solicited tributes from people who had either studied with Marilyn or done workshops with her. And Natalie interweaves those voices into her really beautiful conclusion, which is such a lovely tribute to Marilyn. Kathy O'Dell's essay, to which you referred, is particularly interesting because of the way she situates Marilyn in relationship to experimental pedagogies. So she draws on Alan Capro and Pauline Oliveros, but also she draws on Marilyn's roots in New England and the relationship that Marilyn had with Unitarianism and the kinds of actions that were appropriate in this particular church. And she also mentions Marilyn's long time, she had this long running performance writing Ada, which was about her, I'm going to get it wrong, I think it was great grandmother, Ada Badger, who was the wife of a preacher and had been the governess to Nathaniel Hawthorne's family. And she would essentially stage a nighttime performance in a costume similar to that that Ada would have worn at the time. And it was not so much we're going to have a seance as we are going to write Ada into existence, to think about who Ada was and what she was. And so this kind of attention on writing, on carefully looking at things, is related to both Unitarianism, to radical pedagogies as practiced by, say, Capro or Pauline Oliveros, and also to the particulars of the pedagogy that Marilyn has employed. So I should also add that Marilyn's form of teaching, and if anyone's interested, there is a really wonderful teaching statement that we published in the book. And also there are descriptions of various workshops that Marilyn runs where on her website, where she talks about her teaching philosophy and gives examples of things that she could do. But Marilyn's idea behind teaching people how to perform is very much about disappearing into the performance and not forcing her own view onto the people that she's teaching. The Nothing Remains that Kathy O'Dell really highlighted is interesting in the context of both Marilyn's work and her pedagogy. You have to look hard for the traces of Marilyn. It's so subtle, and yet I think so important as we hopefully come out of this pandemic year and some months and have begun to think about how we understand time, how we relate to time, and what slow time and stepping back and less engagement with screen time might mean. Marilyn's work becomes very, very relevant because it is so slow, it is so subtle, and it demands a different kind of attention than most spectacles do. Honestly, and this is pretty evident throughout the book. Many of her performances, almost nothing happens and nothing remains at the end of the performance. There's nothing to scoop up or to display. If you go visit Marilyn in Boston, you will know that there's almost nothing displayed in her home from her performances, but there are kind of artifacts or things that happen along the way. So hopefully that's a good answer. And I would urge everyone to read Kathy's wonderful essay, so beautifully researched and so thoughtful. It's not just about Marilyn, but although it is about Marilyn, but also about a very different way of approaching teaching.
Yeah, and it's situating her in this pedagogical practice of deep listening, and thinking about how we collapse the hierarchical power structures, both within the classroom, and how we're thinking about that in terms of institutions, so there can be more listening spaces as we move forward out of the pandemic. And yes, we're going to, and I think that's a great segue. As you're talking about, these the non-spectacle, and I define these acts as like encounters, with the everyday, with the sense of time, and this idea that something is of the moment and then it disappears. How would you how are you thinking about that in terms of feminist practices? Because I think there is there is an aesthetic of feminist practice that is about these interrelational aesthetics that occur in the moment and then do disappear. And so as a feminist art historian, and documenting these acts or these happenstance moments, how are you finding, I know that can be problematic at times, but do you think that is very particular to feminist artistic practices?
Well, first of all, I would say that there are a variety of feminist artistic practices. And of course, in your lovely introduction, you mentioned I'm working on a book with Annie Sprinkle and Elizabeth Stevens, and that is a very different type of feminist practice than Marilyn, although they know each other well, have performed together in several festivals. And when Beth Stevens, who's a professor of sculpture at UC Santa Cruz, organized a symposium about interventionist art, Marilyn was invited to perform. One of the things that I would like to stress is that Marilyn's performance trajectory changed a great deal over the years she's performed. So in the book, we talk about how she started doing performances and happenings even as a teenager when she was still in high school. And then when she went to college in Boston, she quickly transitioned to doing very, very experimental work that could be characterized as actions or happenings. They were definitely not theatrical, and they often used sight. But there still was a certain element of theatrical performance, not that the works themselves were theatrical, but that they were in a space. Many of them took place in the various spaces that Mobius claimed over the years, and that they involved props. So her earliest Pig Baby series, which included kind of sewing together this doll from animal bones and a dead fish head and baking bread, but cooking hair in the bread. So and then, well, it baked, you got the bread smell, but also the scorched hair smell. Those required a lot of props and a setting. And some of Marilyn's radical simplicity really developed when the culture wars happened and made it very difficult to do performance in the United States. So she was still based in Boston. Mobius, which was the organization she had founded, was still going on. But she branched out and began performing more in other parts of the world. And she has performed pretty much on every continent. I'd have to look. We have a very extensive appendix, which is actually rather helpful because Marilyn's sort of list of all her performances also kind of charts the international performance world. But I would say it was with these performances that you really encountered a kind of radical self-abnegation, which one can see as a very feminist strategy. Marilyn was too young to be part of the 70s feminist that criticized a lot of cultures and organizations, but she also was too old, excuse me, to be part of the kind of sex positive feminist. So she fell in between. When she started performing in Europe,
you have some water? Do you want to the tickle in your throat?
I think I'm okay now. I don't have water close by. Sorry about that. It's really, things are really blooming here. Anyway, when she started performing in the various countries, she made it a point to find out what the history of the place was, what kind of stories there were in the place she was going, and then she would enact those stories very, very subtly. So oftentimes you could almost miss these performances. She also stopped using a lot of language in the performances out of sensitivity to the country in which she was. So she would say very little, or in some cases, take the time to learn short request in the language from the country in which she was performing. So I see this kind of intersectionality, this sensitivity, this very anti-colonialist and anti-oppression approach as a very feminist strategy. And I think we see it now more in perhaps more contemporary feminist performances as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that, so we're going to be giving a 30% discount to this book. And you can hear Jennie Klein talk in conversation with Natalie Loveless, Paul Couillard, Lucian O'Connor, and Kathy O'Dell about all the contributing chapters in this book. And yes, please And also Marilyn Arsem is giving a workshop talking about pedagogy. You'll actually be able, this is a unique opportunity to study with Marilyn. And some of the questions that she asks, she'll be inviting you to go and create work in public space. And one of the contradictions of this conference is we're thinking about, actions in public space, performance practice in public space, but the symposium is all online. But it gives us an opportunity to work with international artists from around the world and be in conversation as a community. So we do hope you will join us all on April 22nd, which is a week on Thursday, to May 9th. And so there'll be 2 weeks of workshops and presentations. And then in week 3, symposium attendees can actually present their own performance in a live stream, performance in public on the Ethernet. So thank you so much for joining me today in conversation, Jennie Klein, and lovely to speak with you and hear your thoughts. And I read the book in 4 days, cover to cover. It was such a joy to read. And, and I do hope other people will become inspired by this book as well. It's a really, exceptional work of scholarship. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I should also add, we have so many beautiful color photographs in this book. We really worked so hard to assemble to make just a beautiful book. So,
yes, yeah, thank you.